and I think we are live. Are we live? Have you pressed the magic button? Yeah.
Yes, we are
Okay.
live.
Okay. I'm going to try and get this right because yesterday it was such a farce. It is Friday, the 23rd of May, 2025.
Perfect.
Welcome to anybody who's watching and or listening or ignoring us to the Peeling Potatoes podcast #1. And the lovely young lady sitting opposite me will now say a few words about herself. You have 60 minutes, Janita.
Okay. Hello, everyone, for listening and watching. My name is Janita, and I live in South Africa. And the gentleman who just introduced himself, not yet.
Are we a little tongue-tied?
Yes, yes. but that's how the chaos works.
Exactly. Anyway, what about the gentleman opposite?
The gentleman opposite me is Frank. And Frank and I met on LinkedIn discussing potatoes.
As you do on this
Yes.
fantastic forum, which is why there is a potato background, because potatoes play a significant role in what we are going to be talking about in this first podcast.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Janita, I'm sure there are millions and millions of listeners who are curious to learn a little bit about you. So you live in South Africa. You live
Yes.
in this tiny little metropolis called Johannesburg. Well, actually, you don't. You live south of this little place called Johannesburg. It's the middle of winter there with you now.
Not really the middle of winter, just the start of winter.
Mm-hmm.
So I live in the south of Johannesburg. That's about 30 to 45 minutes drive away. And I think the reason why we have this cold every morning is because we live close to a river.
Ah.
Yes. But it's a beautiful small town in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by farms. Some mornings, the morning traffic would be some cows crossing the road. But that's a lot of fun. Some
I'm
days
sure.
I can,
I'm
yes,
sure it is. Sure. Yeah.
some days I can hear the sheep from some neighbors 2 plots down. Sometimes chickens as well. So it's really a lot of fun. We have a lot of trees also surrounding us. So we have owls that we can listen to in the evenings. Um, there's a lot of bats as well. My son is very scared of the bats. And during the day, a lot of different kind of birds that we like to sit and watch while we work.
Exactly. So here's an interesting excuse. Sorry, Miss So and So, that your son's school teacher. We were late for school this morning because there were 3 cows crossing the road, and they decided to take their time. Does this cut as an excuse for being late on the school run?
No, not really. But it's not just 3 cows, it's maybe 80.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
Quite a
Oh,
big herd.
wow. Okay. So I have only known you for a couple of months, and I still learn a lot about you and your environment. And this is something new. Yeah. So,
Yes.
of course, I know a little bit more. We're not going to disclose that. But this whole agricultural background in your neighborhood is totally new to me. Thank you for sharing that, at least to me and
My
to the
pleasure.
rest.
It's my pleasure. The reason it came to mind was I actually saw the cows this morning. They weren't crossing the road, but I did see them.
Do they go to cow school?
I don't know, maybe. I would like to know what they are discussing every day as they walk through the houses
Mm,
to different parts where they can feed.
okay. Right. Okay. Well, I'm sure we'll find some topics in this, but I think is people who have sort of survived the first few minutes of this podcast will sort of begin to understand that We are two highly creative people, I think, aren't we?
Yes, definitely. I agree with that.
Talking about potatoes as you do on LinkedIn. Yeah, I mean,
Yes.
it's just magic. Okay, right. So what are we going to do today?
I think you have to tell us a little bit about yourself. Where are
What
you from? What do you do? What is your village like? The listeners don't know.
They don't know. Okay, so, well, I do not live in South Africa, for starters.
Yes.
I live 8,500 kilometers north in the top northeastern corner of France, where we drink lots of wine, eat lots of cheese, and still manage to survive without getting too many heart attacks in the process. So it's a little, okay, it's a little complicated. I'll keep it simple. I was born in Germany 64 years ago. I grew up in different countries around the world. And 20 years ago, my wife and I decided we need neutral territory, and we moved to France, which is where we have been living. And I live in a tiny, tiny, tiny little village of 750 inhabitants in a wine growing area. We have the northernmost the northernmost vineyards in the entire French Republic. We produce mainly white wine and sparkling wine, which here is called Crémant. It's not called Champagne because that's a protected name. It's called Crémant in French. Sparkling wine, Prosecco, you call it what it wants. It's all the same stuff, and it tastes rather good. We have a cooperative here, and I'm negotiating with them for them to lay a pipeline from the cooperative to our kitchen, where we can just sort of turn on the wine tap.
Just open the tap.
Just open the tap, put in a glass. But Janita here, of course, is also from a wine growing area, and I'm on the hunt for South African wines. Yeah, so I'm becoming very disloyal to my host country. Yeah, yeah. So I think that's all there is. I don't know. People will find out more about us as we proceed. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Do you have cows in your area?
Not four-legged ones.
Okay. Okay.
In a word, no. So apart from grapes, we also have maize fields and wheat, I think, wheat or some grain. But a lot of it is used to, I don't actually know what for, because the corn or the maize is used to feed something or someone, but not people. Because I remember when we first moved here 20 years ago, we were walking through cornfields and I thought, oh, we can eat these, can't we? So we stole a cob, and I think we boiled it for about 6 hours. It still didn't sort of become soft and edible. So we then learned there is corn and there is corn. There's industrial corn, which is used as corn food for animals. And then there's the human stuff that we can eat and enjoy. So that is, but I do confess, in September, October, when our harvest season starts in the Northern Hemisphere, I can be seen sneaking through the vineyards and testing the grapes on a rather permanent basis.
Why not?
Don't tell that to neighbors.
No, I won't. They don't even know me.
Therein lies the advantage.
Yes.
Anyway, so a little bit about ourselves, and then we're going to talk about this thing that we do. It's called Brida,
Yes.
and I think we should start with the little introduction that we have a lot of vocabulary in this funny environment that we have that we work in.
Yes.
And it starts with our names. So officially you are called Janita, and it can be seen on the bottom there. And officially I am called Frank. But we also have two other names. So could you like to reveal your reader name, please?
Let's start with your name first, because let's go back just 2 steps. And so Brida is an imaginary town.
Correct.
With a lot of different stores, so we call them spaces.
Exactly.
Yes, and Frank is the mayor of this town.
Exactly, exactly. Which is why I have the name Mayor. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And then my name is Fruit Loop. So
Perfectly
Frank,
normal.
yes, perfectly normal. So would you like to share why my name is Fruit Loop?
Because I think you're just unique. I can't say it in any other way. No, Fruit Loop, because you have a very colorful, optimistic, positive view on life. Um, nothing really phases you. And if it does, you have a special way in dealing with it. I'm beginning to see that and learn that. And you're just a colorful, lively, dare I say, bubbly personality. But behind all of this is a very, very intelligent woman who has Fruit Loopy questions, which they sort of hit you from behind and they hit you on the back of the head. And the impact is like, where did this come from? And this is a really good question. And it makes you think. So may I introduce you to Fruit Loop, because this highly intelligent young lady just knows how to really communicate well. Of course, she's a generation younger than me, so that helps as well. You know, the old goat that I am just doesn't have it anymore. You know, past my sell-by date. Maybe I should go to the abattoirs.
Wow. No.
No, I think
We still need a mayor in Brida, so you can't go there.
well, yeah, okay.
And someone to
Not
taste the grapes for the best wine.
well, that comes from South Africa, so I'll have to go and steal.
Okay. I think maybe you should come over to taste some grapes.
Well, test the grapes. I've got to drink this stuff, and this is in my bucket list. I have committed myself that by May 2026, I will be there. There's a long story behind this commitment, but yes, I have committed myself that if Fruit Loop and I get our act together and actually manage to get this project working, I will have a cup of coffee with her, maybe a glass of wine, eat something together. This is my plan. In 12 months, I want to be 8,500 kilometers further south, having a face-to-face conversation. Because the beauty of this weird combination is we actually have never met physically. We have never stood on the same patch of ground together. Yet all this magic somehow works. Yeah, and this is one of the beauties of what we have created and are creating here. Yeah.
Yes, definitely. But that's also part of our 1,000 messages we send weekly or daily, depends on the day. And
Yes.
then also a lot of meetings during the week if we have the time.
Yeah.
Sometimes we see each other once a week. Sometimes we see each other 3 or 4 times a week.
Mm. But let's put it this way: if WhatsApp were to charge for every message we send, I think they'd have to basically say, okay, this is a separate account. We have created the WhatsApp message count index, and I've stopped counting them, but sort of between 80 and 150 messages between the two of us tends to be the norm. On weekends, it quietens down because she gets sick of me, and I can understand that. And you have other things to look after and do during the weekends, but sort of the occasional ping comes through, and oh, really? So there you go. So communication is in our blood, yeah, and it's very important in this relationship as well, because running this reader thing that we do over a distance of 8,500 kilometers with everybody else involved in this, it's an interesting project, and I'm glad that Janita sort of read my funny potato article and said hello. Serendipity at its best.
Yes. Yes. So thank you for your kind words. Now, I don't know. Do you want to start with the interview questions?
Well, I thought you were Well, who's interviewing whom?
I'm interviewing you. I'm going to ask you a couple
Well,
of questions.
actually, this is a pretend interview, isn't
a
it?
pretend, yes, a pretend interview, but it's to help our listeners to get to know us and exactly what we do at Brida. And then I also included some Fruit Loopy questions, which you know about.
Mm.
Yes.
And then we have some practical info, because behind all the weird, wonderful things that we do is actually a very serious pedagogical side. So that
Yes.
we have to explain to our listeners and viewers as well, that in this somewhat strange big planet that we are living on at the moment, and where things are sort of going a little south and pear-shaped, there is this little tiny virtual town in the specific place on this planet where people can meet, have fun, and improve their English skills at the same time. And so
Yes.
this is what we're trying to say today. But because it is actually a thing that I created, Janita has sort of the honor of structuring it in some form that I'm not going to ramble on for hours and bore everybody to death. So we have this pretend interview. It's more a conversation. Janita also has the answers that I'm going to say, the official version, but I'm sure in between she's going to drag some hidden details out of me as well. So Janita, shall we rock and roll?
Yes. Okay. So let's start with what is Brida and how did this idea come to life? This is my favorite story, or my favorite part.
Yes, and about 2 hours before we met this morning for this pretend interview, I actually managed to dig up some pictures.
Yes.
Right, so cast your mind back 10 years to 2015, July, August, our summer in the Northern Hemisphere. And I had come out of a rather deep patch in my life, which I'm not going to bore listeners with. But it was basically my ground zero. And I had a big blank piece of paper in front of me and the question, what am I going to do now? And I created a summer program for kids, which was something I had never done before. It was completely new. Yeah.
Yes.
Because my background is corporate education, talking with kind people in Cheerio environments. So Cheerios are the opposite to Fruit Loops.
Yes.
Welcome to our vocabulary. And I got a bunch of kids to basically observe their environment, draw it on a huge brown piece of paper, which covered the entire length of what was then my training room, 2 walls out of the 4. And they drew an imaginary town and they told stories. They put things they drew the paper, they drew pictures on the paper, they put stickers of little characters, and then they told stories. And the parents and the grandparents saw this and said, "What's this?" And I said, "Well, it's just your kids learning English. I'm sorry, it's just what I do." And the parents liked it, the grandparents liked it. So out of the summer program evolved a new concept where I had adults between 18 and 108 draw pictures and talk about their houses, the stuff they have in their rooms. There was actually one famous person where a married man forgot to draw the kitchen in his house, because why should I have a kitchen when I have a wife who does all of that?
Yes.
And out of these houses, that we sort of group, these houses group into towns, and I had about 7 different towns, 7 different groups of adults. And these towns started communicating with each other. And one of these towns was called Brida. And the name comes from the 2 original founders of this town, called Brigitte and Danielle. Now, they both worked in our local hospital. One is a cleaner, a cleaner sort of tidy upper person, and one was a nurse. One of them actually lives here in the village. And it wasn't the prettiest town. And there is actually a map that is still available. I think it's on our website where you can have a look at it. This is how it all started. It wasn't the prettiest town, but it actually had the best name, Brida. Now, some of you may actually know that there's also a book by Paulo Coelho, the Brazilian author, also called Brida. And for a long time, I was afraid I was going to get this was how big my vision was at the time. I was going to get a letter from his lawyers, desist in using this name. It's never happened. I don't think it will happen because there's lots of things with Brida in them around the world, so it's okay. And this town sort of replaced all the 6 others, and it grew. And we had history associations, we had characters, we had a whole bunch of activities. It became very complicated. And then during the pandemic, where we were in France, at least in France, we were all very severely locked in, locked under, and locked down. I started playing with this online idea, had a look at some Facebook groups of like 250,000 followers and stuff like this, and thought, okay, this is Facebook, this is social media. I can actually do this outside this environment. I figured out how to get the software together, and I built what is now the Brida Community website. That is all my own work. It's not that difficult. And then I needed somehow an angle to start it, and that took another 6 months. And then I think about 3 or 4 years ago, I finally found the handle to this door, opened it, and let the people that I knew at the time walk in. Some of them are still here 3 or 4 years later. And out of this has grown this online community of people. What we have in common is everybody wants to share and improve their English communication skills.
Yes.
But we do it together.
Yes.
That's how it all started.
Okay. So basically that answers my next question. And the next question was, how is Brida different from a typical English class?
Well, you've experienced this for about 2 months.
Of course.
You're the new Fruit Loop in the loop. Maybe you can tell it to me how, because you came into this world, didn't know anything about it. You do teach yourself.
Yes.
How would you actually answer this question? Because from your perspective, what did you actually discover when you came in here?
Well, first there's a lot of freedom. So a lot of freedom to express yourself. And then we also came up with some new ideas and new things to do. And we started with some planning on creating a lunch meeting.
Mm-hmm. This is a message from our sponsors. Please join us.
Join us for lunch with Janita and Frank on Thursdays.
11:30.
Yes. No, but like the freedom that you have and the ways that you can express yourself, and we discuss different topics. There's also the people. I think that's the part that also convinced me. Different levels of English, but they all have a way to communicate with each other. And there's no teaching grammar and sentence structures and passive voice and conditionals
and prepositions.
Prepositions in, on, and at. No, there's no such things. So we do focus on maybe correcting them if they made a mistake or if they can't find the word that they are looking for, but not constantly. We are not a very serious English class where you have to take notes and write tests.
Exactly. So in answer to that original question, you cannot compare Brida with anything else that
No.
is remotely available. Um, because what you classify as freedom, I would say it's a very natural way of learning the language.
Exactly.
And this reflects a little bit my own background, because I have lived in different countries. I'm bilingual of English German because of my nationality. I moved to France, and had I known when I was a teenager and I lived in Australia, had I known that at that time that I would be living in France, maybe I wouldn't have given my French teacher such a difficult time, as adolescent boys can do with inexperienced teachers.
Yes.
But 20 years ago, I moved to France. I had rudimentary school French. I didn't actually take any structured classes. And I observe my surroundings. I speak with people. Okay, after 20 years, you attain a certain fluency. But it was all a very natural process. And
Yes.
I was privileged. I chose the right storks when they flew past, and I was very privileged to live in different countries, experience this multicultural environment. Not many people have that. So
Yes.
Brida is a simulation of reality in a protected environment. Yeah, so you go
Yes.
around in this virtual town that I created and that Janita sort of then tore down and rebuilt because it was much better. Um,
Just sharing new ideas, and then we rebuilt the whole town.
that's the diplomatic way of saying it.
Yes.
But the concept is you mix and mingle, meet different people in various possibilities that we offer, and just
Yes.
do stuff together. And this is all done in English. And if it goes slightly wrong, then Janita and we are there to help you. And that is what you're going to do. Yeah. So if you come to us and say, "Can I please have 15 exercises in prepositions?" You're not going to get that.
Well, it depends. It depends.
Well, you're
If
not going to
that's
get it
what
from
you
me.
need, I can help you.
Okay, so that's maybe where we differentiate a little bit.
Yes, but that is not our main focus.
It's
Our
not our
main
main.
focus is to have conversations and to actually talk with each other instead of focusing on all that.
Exactly.
But I do have a student, let's call her a student, but she's actually
Mm,
a member of Brida,
mm,
maybe one of my past students.
mm.
And she is also starting to warm up into Brida, and she asked me initially for homework and tasks and exercises and all kinds of things, and now she kind of forgot
She's right.
about it.
Yeah, and she's writing haikus.
Yeah, she's writing haikus. She also came up with her own plan that Frank and I decided that she's going to do it because it was her idea.
Mm-hmm.
So she's happy with that. So she, even though she hasn't met any of the other members yet due to her work schedule,
Mm.
she's very comfortable, and through her haikus she also expresses herself, and that is also a part of the freedom that you have in Brida. If you want to respond to someone's questions, or if you want to post something that you did or something you feel proud of, all the members are there to support you and to give
Exactly.
their opinions.
Mm.
And that is also a part of what makes it different.
Yes, and so you were sort of alluding to what this thing actually looks like. So Brida looks. So
Yes.
I can just imagine, what are they talking about? What's this fictitious town thing? So Brida is on its own platform, on our own servers, and it looks like any other social media site, like LinkedIn, Facebook, and whatever else is floating around. But it's a niche community, and you enter it. It's a password protected environment. You enter it, and then you can post like you do on any other social media. You can post something, and then we have, Janita and I have meetings either together or individual, depending on what happens. And there you can meet other people, talk with them. It's a Zoom link. We have Frank's Cafe and we have Janita's Cafe.
Yes.
But if people just want to speak with Fruit Loop and do not want to speak with me, which I perfectly understand, not, they can speak with you. And should anyone find the audacity to speak with me, then they can do that in Frank's Cafe and so on. So it's this social media space simulated into a French village or town with different spaces, different buildings, and everybody meets and does something in English. Now, it is a
Yes.
little abstract and difficult to comprehend, and it's not the easiest place to start. And that's why the entrance, like our resident, we call them residents. So you're not a resident. Sorry, you're not a student. Yeah, you're a
Yes.
resident, and
Yes.
this is psychologically so important. Yeah, because you are part of this town, this community, and you are invited to do something. And in this
Yes.
particular case, you said so and so wants to do this, and I said, well, perfect, no problem. But give her the ownership. Let her organize it. Let
Yes.
her post it. Let her do everything, and we will support her.
Yes.
Fruit Loop and I as hosts slash trainers, facilitators, teachers, whatever this thing is, and the rest of the community. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, definitely. Okay. But there's also an add-on question, why? Why do we do this? But it's an easy answer because we care more about our residents or our members than we actually care about their grammar.
Yes. Yes. Now the purists are going to say, "Oh, quelle horreur! How can you do this? We have to
You
speak
can't do this.
perfect nature. You have to speak perfect British or American English with perfect grammar." In certain circumstances and cases, that is perfectly true. I'm not going to discount that. But the reality of it, and this is where my 64-year-old journey comes into it, the reality is totally, totally different.
Exactly. Yeah? There's some native speakers who doesn't even know how to use certain grammar.
Yeah.
So why should our residents know how to use that?
Yes, if a situation warrants it, we will support them, and we say, okay,
yes.
the precision is important, the right structures are important. We can do that. We're not that loopy, but in your day-to-day activity, just imagine, you're living in country A and you're speaking with somebody in country B, and English is not your native language. You're both in the same situation. You're going to be struggling. How am I going to get this across? How am I going to say this? And if you get the message across somehow, and the other person understands what it is you're saying and actually does what it is you want to do, then that's fine. That's fine. Yeah. And that's the principle we operate on. Yeah. And because Janita and I are such caring people, we care about you. We want you to progress and want you to, to enjoy yourself and learn languages, English in a more natural environment. This is why we created this.
Yes, exactly. So, do you have any funny or memorable moments that you can share from a Brida meetup?
Funny and memorable, I think. Well, I have an answer here, but there's two answers. Well, there's probably thousands of answers because I've been doing this for such a long time. I want to go back maybe 8 or 9 years when we had the Brida History Association. And this was still before the online thing and so on. There was a group of people, and we wanted to create a story of how the gardens in Versailles, the palace of Louis XIV, west of Paris, how they came to be. And of course, there was a resident of Brida who traveled from Brida to Versailles and did his thing. And then we said, well, actually, where is this town, Brida? Because it was just this abstract thing on a piece of paper.
Yes.
And we decided, the Brida History Association, one of which is still a client of mine. She's not part of the community, but she's still a client of mine 10 years later. We decided that we would put Brida near the French town of Perpignan, which is on the Mediterranean coast, pretty close to the French-Spanish border. So that was a memorable event because that actually sort of put this thing into context. And then if we sort of then did trips from Brida, we would have to take the drive down to Barcelona and fly from Barcelona. So when we'd organize trips, we would always check, the flight departure times from Barcelona to any destination, or take the train from Perpignan. So we would have to drive from Brida to Perpignan to take the train, the TGV from Perpignan to Paris. So it actually became quite three-dimensional. So that was the first memorable moment. I think the second memorable moment was the second time you and I met, and we talked about this cultural do's and don'ts.
Yes.
How to, how do you greet each other? How do you get invited to somebody? What do you bring as a hostess gift? That video is available to community members online in our community space.
Yes.
And it is memorable because it actually told me, and I said, this is a person I want to work with, come hell and high water. Yeah.
Yes.
It worked. So that would be the second memorable moment. Also the start of the Brida Revolution, but that's a different story.
That's a story for another day.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So in this short period that you've been here, do you have any memorable moments that you can think of where you thought, oh God, do I want to really go here or do something, or do I want to escape while I can?
No, no, I don't want to escape. I think the Fruit Loopy questions that I get to ask the members, because sometimes it puts them in a tight spot. And then they have to think carefully about their answers. And I like that.
Yes.
Because they have to think out of the box. And that is something that I really, really enjoy. And I think that is, so there's quite a few things. So when we had to do the random objects, or when we spoke about the random objects in the meeting, even yesterday, when Monica showed up with the same thing I chose previously.
Correct, yes.
So, yes. So the random objects, that was definitely a highlight. Because it was so much fun, and we laughed so much at the different objects that each resident chose. Yes. And then
my random object is now hanging in my
your
office.
Bag.
Yeah, it has a special place now. Yeah.
Yes, the shopping bag. And also how you would use this object to defend yourself. I think that was one of the best things. One of the best questions to ask. But that was definitely memorable.
It was, because certainly, so Janita, or both of us, but it's actually more Janita who prepares these questions, and she sends them to me in advance, and then I think, oh my God. And I don't let Janita off the hook. I mean, she has to contribute just as much as everybody else.
I have to participate.
We just have the added advantage that maybe we are slightly more prepared for what's coming than people who join us. Because part of the educational pedagogical process is to be spontaneous. Because again, in using a language in real life, traditional methods are you say this and you expect that answer, which if you're speaking with robots is probably the best way to go about it. But humans are unpredictable. And school books will not, we don't all use the same school books. So part of our approach is to have this supported unpredictability. you may trip over, but we're there to pick you up again. And with this comes the so important fact of gaining confidence in
Yes.
speaking with strangers, speaking in unfamiliar situations. People underestimate how important that is. Yeah.
Yes.
Because again, I'm sorry, I speak from experience, but if you are in an environment where you're speaking in a third language that is not your own, or a second language that is not your own, you have to fight through the system.
Yes.
You have to fight tooth and nail. You have to, if you don't have the vocabulary, yeah, you have to invent a way of communicating. And we simulate this in a protected,
Yes.
fun environment. Yeah.
Yes. Especially with the questions that they don't know what I'm going to ask. So they do know about the Fruit Loopy questions, and they know that they have to be prepared slightly because they might be a silly question. But during the past couple of months or 2 months, we've seen a lot of the residents who actually grew and who are starting to open up, and they are more comfortable talking about things that they don't know anything about.
Exactly.
And that is a part of the goal.
Exactly. So shall we give the listeners and the viewers some examples of a typical Fruit Loopy question?
We can. So one question: if Brida had a national fruit, what would it be and why?
So there you go. Yeah. So a national fruit, Brida. So what is this thing called Brida? And national fruit. So putting on my creative thinking cap and looking at my pre-prepared answers, I think it would be the apple.
Okay.
I don't know if you agree, but a couple of days ago, Janita and I had this conversation about paradise.
Yes.
And I'm not going to go into too great a detail, but it did,
no, I don't think so.
it did involve an apple. And we have a resident poet as well, Bochum Miller, who lives and works in Strasbourg, 60, 70 kilometers south of where I live. And so somehow this strange combination sort of became the national fruit, apple. And there's actually also a story of my childhood. When my mother packed school lunches, she would always pack an apple. And at that time, I didn't like apples. So I hid them in my wardrobe.
No.
Yes, this is thinking that somehow these apples will get used, disappear, do something, but I don't have to eat them. And my mother on a Saturday afternoon, she'd been doing the laundry, opens my wardrobe, and this aroma of apples hits her. And then
Not a good aroma.
And then she had a look, and she discovered my row of apples. I think for 2 days I was on an apple diet. Yeah, so I had to eat all the apples, and there you go. That's why I think apples are the national fruit. So that's the Fruit Loop. Do you have any more Fruit Loopy questions? Because these are actually quite fun.
Yes, I do. But just to add, why didn't you choose pineapple for your national fruit?
Well, this
You remember the pineapple post?
Yeah, I do remember the pineapple post, and you also know what I did with the pineapple post. Yeah,
Yes.
because it kind of got my creative side going, and I wrote a column, a blog post or something, but it actually never got published.
Yes.
Because I was still processing this South African invasion.
Yes.
And I have since sort of begun to understand that if I step out of line, or if I do something that does not meet your approval, you ignore it. And that is the sign, at least my interpretation of the sign, that something may not be so good. And I had in our collaboration process, or sort of figuring out how we're going to do things. And I sort of said, and by the way, I've got this old goat, that would be me, and pineapple theory idea, and you never reacted.
And then you sent it to me and I read it and it was actually very good.
Yes, but the but the courage it took me to send this, because we have this incredible dynamics.
Yes.
But it can be, the people may think, well, no, what is it with these two? Yeah, and it can go into a whole lot of interpretations, which it's dangerous territory. Yeah,
and it can be questionable.
Yes, yeah, but
yes.
it's perfectly, we're perfectly above board, etc., etc. You live in South Africa. I'm a different generation. You're married, have a kid. I'm married, and so on and so forth. But this chemistry, people think, oh, no, are they or are they not? Yeah, and what is it with these two? So, with all of this sensitivity in mind, I sort of I wrote it, I let it go out, and then it gets stored. And there's a couple of these things that I've sort of written.
Yes.
So the pineapple one went to you. It's never been published anywhere. But I also have a post which I did publish. It took me 3 days to decide, am I going to do this? And
then I told you to do it.
But you didn't actually know what was
coming. Yes, I didn't know what was coming.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where I described you as my business soulmate, because this is what it is.
Yes.
This is what I publicly declare. You are my business soulmate. I have complete confidence and trust in what you do. Yeah. We think alike. And that's part of this magic and chemistry that we are infusing into this Brida community. Yeah.
Yes.
And yeah, so that's why I didn't use pineapple, because I still respect that privacy, the individual privacy that you have, but also our joint privacy that we have created.
Yes.
I think you've got to sort of, it's difficult to get one's head around it if you're sitting on the outside. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, definitely.
But we have this incredible bond, and I will use it where it's appropriate, but it's something then that stays under wraps, private, for those who need to know. Yeah.
Yes. And sometimes I just run out of time. I don't ignore everything. Or it takes me some time to process before I respond.
Well,
then we send messages and then I forget about what we were talking about in the beginning.
Yeah. But this is I think this is what this learning curve is about. Is the two people meet, they hit it off incredibly well within a respectable environment. There are boundaries, and we both know those. But you're still establishing this relationship.
Yes.
And figuring out, okay, now what is appropriate? What can I say? But it's, I think in this post about the business soulmate, it's about, I think I allude to John Steinbeck's tortilla flat. Yeah. Drink wine together and eat potatoes. Yeah.
Yes.
So the more we cooperate, the more we work, the more we learn from each other, the more we understand each other. And the better it is actually for the community members, for the residents to learn, because we just have this incredible thing, and it sort of, people like it, and they say, oh, this is really nice, Frank. And yet I had Monica in Australia send me a WhatsApp this morning. Listen to all the episodes. Really glad you've met Janita, and hope it's relieved the stress. And well, actually, it hasn't. It's increased the stress. But
but like I mentioned, that is all my fault.
No. And Rosie in Brazil, who sort of says, oh my God, and then and so on and so forth.
Yes.
And people notice this chemistry, and that's part of the magic that we are trying to do. So
exactly.
Yeah, we're hosts. Yeah, we're 8,500 kilometers apart. We will have this glass of wine together.
Yes.
But we're hosts of a community. Yeah, you're welcome to join us and participate and do stuff. Yeah, because we're looking after you. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, so let's change the topic. In Brida, if chickens can talk, so what is the latest gossip that they are clucking about?
Or Fruit Loop, they're not talking.
So what are they doing?
They're complaining.
Why? Why are they complaining?
Well, this time it actually is really your fault, because you came in and said, well, this is a nice place, but it's, it's a man's thing. It's been run by a man. It needs a makeover. Yeah. So you rip everything out.
Shake it up a little bit.
Yeah. You rip it out. You rebuild the entire town.
Yes.
And you do the interior decorations. So you call in the builders, and then you call in the interior decorators, i.e. yourself, and you paint the town pink and yeah. And the chickens are wondering, well, what about us? Yeah, we'd like a new chicken coop, please. Where are the builders? So that's what they're clucking about at the moment. So they're not happy bunnies or chickens.
They do have two spaces where they might fit in. The one is the Brida farm, and the other one is the pet shop.
Let's not go with the Brida farm.
Okay. So we'll send them to the pet shop.
To the pet shop, yes. Buy a chicken. Sponsor a chicken. There you go.
Sponsor a chicken. Yes, and then we can cook chicken and potato for dinner.
Oh,
with wine.
They don't want to hear that.
No, I'm just joking. Shame. We'll give them names and then we don't eat them.
Yes. Okay. So we'll do this next week. Sponsor a chicken run.
Okay. Okay. So another question: lost socks in Brida don't disappear; they turn into what?
Yes, this magic scenario where you do the laundry and you think you've put all the socks into the washing machine, and then you take them out and there's one missing.
Yes.
Well, if dear listener and dear viewer, you find that you're in the situation that you are missing a sock in the laundry, it actually might have run away and come to Brida, where it becomes a boot. And maybe this song sung by Nancy Sinatra, these boots are made for walking.
Yes.
So the socks turn into boots and they walk through town and meet people and do things together, which is what Brida is all about.
Oh, wow.
So I
would like a new pair of boots.
Send me the socks.
Okay. I have two. One is mine and the other one is my son's that went missing. So I'll send those two.
Okay. And then we will.
But
that was my weekend.
So strangely enough, socks in my house turn into Tupperware lids, like plastic container lids. I have a lot of lids and I don't have the actual container for it. And then I have missing socks. So I think somewhere they change into container lids, plastic container lids.
This is music. This is really music to my ears.
Why?
Because the next time you tease me about me losing a 50-meter hose.
Yes.
My revenge will be, and your Tupperware?
And your Tupperware? They are not lost. I don't know where they go. Well, the one my son lost at school, he left it in the tree, in the playground.
How did that get there?
He took it with him to the playground, put it in the tree, played, forgot about it, and now it's gone.
We have to send out a message to all the residents. Have you seen, what can you describe this Tupperware? What color it is? And was it round, square? It's
rectangular, short, see-through, blue lid.
Okay. So if anybody's seen
about it.
If anybody has seen a non-specific short rectangular piece of Tupperware, would they please contact us and we can return it to its rightful owner.
We'll see. Okay. So in Brida, we also have a cafe. And let's say this is the Unicorn Cafe in Brida. So what magical drink would you order?
Well, I would order the tongue loosener.
Okay, that sounds interesting. So what would be the ingredients?
Well, I can't tell you that. Well, I
Well,
can't
why
tell.
not?
Well, it's a secret recipe because
But
the
we
ingredient
like to share recipes in Brida.
we do, but some are top secret, need to know only.
Okay.
Because the tongue loosener is the magic that is between us. And are we going to share that secret?
I don't think we have a secret ingredient. It just happens magically.
Exactly. So you just order a tongue loosener. You come to the Brida Cafe, order a tongue loosener, and you find yourself communicating in English with us. So so
Perfect.
we don't know how it happens. It just happens. And there you go.
Yes.
You get the tongue loosener.
Okay. I like that idea. Maybe we
Yes.
should add it to the menu.
Yes. Maybe we should have a competition.
Oh, yes.
Have a
That's a good
competition.
idea.
Make your
Who-
own. Who can make the best tongue loosener? What ingredients would you put
Yes.
into it? Okay. Right. Okay.
Are you taking notes?
I am. It's on the potato list.
Okay. That's how the magic happens.
Yes, we have weird names for normal things. So our potato list is what Cheerios call to-do lists. Yeah, and we
Yes.
put them into our coffee tin, and then we do something with it. Yeah.
And the coffee tin is actually a shared Google Drive folder.
Yeah.
So we have special names for everything we do.
Yes. And we have bug sheets as well, which
Oh,
are
yes.
our respective diary entries for the week. I've uploaded my bug sheet into the appropriate tin in the coffee tin, so you can have a look what I'm
Yes.
doing next week.
Okay. Mine is clear for now.
Yes, yes. Yes. Fruit Loop would love to speak to you, which is why we want you
Yes.
to join Brida.
Exactly.
So because Fruit Loop has too much time on her hands, and you know what that's going to lead to: crazy ideas and hard work for me.
I already have a crazy idea.
Okay. Why does this worry me? Yeah. Are you going to tell me now, or are you going to make me suffer?
I sent you the picture yesterday of the sketchbook and the pencils.
Oh, yes. And the
Yes.
order, go buy yourself. And yeah, okay.
Yes, we'll add that to the potato list for next week.
Okay. There you go. So I hope people are still with us after this.
I hope so too.
Raise your hand if you are there. Yeah.
I'm here.
So am I.
Okay, and the potatoes behind you as well. They also
Yes.
have their hands
Yes.
raised.
Yes,
Except
exactly.
for the little grumpy one there in the corner.
Yeah, you want to put a knife to him, don't you? Yeah. No,
Yes.
He's the
No.
Fruit Loop. No, he's the Fruit Loopy question. Yeah, he's the one who's going to lob the question from you to the back of my head and make me think. Yeah.
Maybe instead of a knife, we can use your shopping bag. We'll add your shopping bag in his hand. If you can remember that conversation.
Yes.
How to defend yourself.
Exactly. Yes. I'm not going to give a demonstration now.
No. That's okay.
Okay.
Of course, we don't want to scare them away. We want
No.
to draw them in.
Exactly. And a good job we are doing as well, I hope. Anyway, do you have any more Fruit Loopy questions?
Of course. Talking about drawing in, if aliens visit Brida once a month, what question do you ask them first?
Well, I'd be very surprised, pleasantly surprised that aliens would want to visit us. Because
there's a lot to offer. There's a cheese shop, there's a coffee shop, there's a fork and bean restaurant, there's a hotel. Who doesn't want to visit?
Exactly. There's a bookshop.
Yes, florist.
Japanese tea garden, which is
yes.
And there's even for aliens reaching retirement age,
yes,
they can stay in the haven.
Yes.
They can if aliens, I mean, if they've been on such a long journey from alien land to Earth to Brida, they might feel a little bit tired and unfit, so they can go to the Brida Sports Center.
Yes.
If aliens are creative and they want to do some painting and some creative work, they can go to the Brida Arts Center and express themselves there.
Yes.
So we would say, well, thank you for coming, and how can we help you? That would be the question I would ask them, just like any other aliens, i.e., the Sting song, I'm an alien, I'm an alien in New York or something like that. So human
Yes.
aliens and extraterrestrial aliens, everybody is welcome to do what you want to do and do it in English. So aliens, I don't know, what do aliens speak? Have you I think your son has a lot of contact with aliens.
Yes, he likes to fight them and protect the garden from them. But there's a program that he watches, also something about aliens doing things in the real life. So the aliens are little drawings that move
Okay.
around, doing things, stealing things, but in like normal real life situations, like the real human world. But they don't really talk to each other. They just make noises and sounds.
But your son can communicate with them, yeah?
I think so. I think so.
Okay,
He has some kind of superpower.
okay. So can you do a sales pitch to these aliens and get them to join Brida?
I can try that.
There you go.
Yes.
That's his weekend
Yes.
activity.
And he's actually very good. So some time ago, he sat in front of my husband's laptop with the headsets and the pen, and he was making notes. He was talking to a fictional character, maybe an alien, I don't know. So he asked, "What is your favorite teddy bear? What is your favorite color?" So he has the practice.
Perfect. Perfect. Your son is now an official ambassador of Brida. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Excellent.
Hereby accredited. Yeah.
And he also gave you a special nickname.
Who, me?
Yes. Can you remember?
This is a major faux pas, Frank. Just tell me.
Frankenstein.
Oh, Frankenstein. That's right. Yes.
Yes.
The revolution that has been Brida. That's right. And that's when I said, yes, that's right. Because when I was a kid and I lived in Adelaide in Australia, there was a company called Peter's Ice Cream. So the kids used to call me Frankenstein Jr. because, of course, Senior was taken. Frankenstein Jr. who eats Peter's ice cream. Yeah. Yes. Sorry, I had forgotten, but it's all a bit of a
That's
blur.
okay.
It's a bit of blur. I'm sorry.
So
I do apologize
okay.
to you, dear Fruit Loop, and to your son for forgetting this important detail.
But that's also because we are continuously talking about new ideas and new plans and all kinds of things.
Yeah, I need
Yes.
my secretary has gone. My secretary has gone, but we actually do have. So my secretary is the chief sleeping officer or something like that, one of our 4 cats. But again, in seriousness, the creativity that we have does actually have support. We have a chaos tamer.
Yes.
And the chaos tamer sits in ChatGPT land. And it is something that I created. And so we do, not for our ideas, but more for the processes that we are establishing and the Cheerio side of all of this. So of course,
yes,
behind the scenes, there's all this serious stuff that we have to do and organize and plan and map out and strategies we have to think about and, all this important, boring stuff. And we use artificial intelligence for that, primarily simply so that someone else can do the boring stuff and we can focus on the fun stuff because we are humans. We are humans.
Yes, so we can have the fun.
We can have the fun, and we get artificial intelligence to do all the boring stuff, and then we say it's good, and then the chaos tamer is happy, and we say it's bad, and the chaos tamer is still happy because the chaos tamer doesn't actually know anything except how to answer our Fruit Loopy and somewhat intelligent questions. So we're not totally out of this world. We do actually have a pretty serious background structure
and a serious system structure, everything. Yes.
Yeah. We just hide it. We just hide it because it's boring. It's Cheerios. It's Cheerio stuff. Yeah.
It's just on a need to know basis.
Yes.
Yeah.
No artificial intelligence was harmed in the making of the conversation.
Luckily not.
Okay. I think the clock's ticking a little bit. We don't want to bore our listeners too much, but maybe they would like to know maybe they're motivated enough to become curious and to wonder what it is that this weird duo is doing. And can I please be a participant or a resident or something? So
Yes. Is there a subscription fee? How do I join? Where do I click? Where do I sign? What do we do?
right. So I talked about the Breeder Revolution, and there was
Yes.
pre-Fruit Loop times and post-Fruit Loop times.
Yes.
And Fruit Loop sort of walked in, said, "Well, I like this place, but it's got to have a female touch to it, and it's got to be spruced up and blah blah blah." And in the process, it's sort of like a meteorite hitting me. So on the serious side of things, Brida has been undergoing not only a facelift on the surface, but also a very, very fundamental business model change. Because
Yes.
before Fruit Loop arrived, it was a monarchy. I was the king. And then the revolution started and Fruit Loop marched in. And out of the monarchy became a democratic republic.
Yes.
And the model that we're it's not 100% final. I'm still mulling over this because the change is, believe me, on the serious side, the changes are huge and fundamental. So it is a town, so you don't pay a fee, you pay a tax, you pay a residence tax.
Yes.
Now, part of my own personal philosophy is that education / the sharing of knowledge and experience is which is what we do here, should
Yes.
be free. But the economic reality is that Janita has bills to pay, I have bills to pay, and if we went to our respective suppliers of whatever it is and we say, well, give us this and we'll pay you with some fun and games on Brida, that it's not going to work.
No, and it's also not going to keep our tummies filled.
Exactly. And your son's tummy. Yeah.
Yes, that too.
And your pet spider's tummy and our pet cats and so on.
Yes.
And so, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The
you have
dogs.
the dogs, you have pets. So the model I'm working on at the moment is, and I'm beginning to figure out how it's all going to work. We have a very low residence tax.
Yes.
In the lower range of anybody's budget, because we are a global community.
Yes.
And one of the things is that, of course, I, living in France, in Europe, have a relatively high income, but also I have relatively high costs. Yeah.
Yes.
Which, if you are in South Africa or somebody in India, if I say this is what you're going to pay, they say to walk away. So we're working on a very low tax level, very low subscription fee level that is affordable for everybody.
Exactly.
We keep the community at a healthy size.
Yes.
It remains a niche community. And then we are creating these events, these spaces, these activities, these, whatever it is that you want to do in English. Some of them will be free. Some of them will charge a nominal fee, maybe because we will get outside contributors to help us, and maybe they will do it for free, or they will want some form of reimbursement.
Yes.
I think the best case in point is our resident poet, who will help us as best as she can, because she has a full-time job elsewhere.
Yes.
Help us with some writing activities, some haiku activities, and so on. But she expressly says, "I will do this out of my love for Brida, or I will do this and not charge a fee." So
Yes.
so of course, then it would be unfair for us to demand extra payment for this, and we pocket it for our empty stomachs, etc. So that's the model. So a very low base tax for which you get a lot. A community possibly the size of maybe 300 to 500 people, not more. But the challenge lies in how you, Janita, and I are going to manage this.
Yes.
And the thinking is there that learning to use the language also means taking ownership, and we have this again with your resident in Saudi Arabia, where she had this idea, and we said, "Great, we can do it."
Yes, but you do it.
But you do it.
Yes, obviously with our help.
Exactly, and this is the important thing. So everything has to have a pedagogical foundation, but it has to have a realistic pedagogical foundation.
Of course.
And so you come up with an idea, and it's 99.9% feasible because the flexibility of Brida is such that you can do almost anything here. And then we say, okay, you go ahead and do it, because you will have to then go out and convince people to do what it is that you want to do and to help you.
Yes,
and
exactly.
That again is communication. You know, you've got 500 people to do this. How are you going to formulate it? How are you going to express yourself? How are you going to follow it up? And
yes,
I suppose if you want to translate this into project management terms, which is sort of the Cheerio world that I used to work in.
Yes.
Fruit Loop and I are project sponsors. We have project managers. So in this case, your resident in Saudi Arabia will be
yes.
a project manager, which is actually also part of her day-to-day real life work. And then there will be project stakeholders, which is the rest of the community.
Yes.
And then she will have to go out and get this project off the ground, follow it through, and evaluate it, and so on. But all the time in the back that she knows we are there as project sponsors to support her.
Yes, exactly.
And to support her not only in how to do this thing, but also to support her in gathering interest and finding project stakeholders. Because we know, as this community grows, we know who is the most appropriate person to partake in that and that. Yeah. So that's the structure. It sounds weird. It sounds complicated, but
actually not.
the main philosophy is it's a niche community. It's not going to cost you the earth.
Yes.
And you're going to get a lot out of it.
You don't have to sponsor a kidney.
No, just two will be fine. Yeah.
Wow. Maybe a chicken kidney or something.
A chicken liver. Yeah.
A chicken liver.
Anyway.
Anyways.
So, and this whole thing. So I'm going to spend the next couple of days putting all this into the website.
Yes.
And building all the builders have arrived again, but this time I have to do it. Is to create the various websites that hold this whole concept together. I'm going to change that and put in the activities, and then there will be links to payment methods, etc., etc. So it's not for free, because we both have to eat, live, and have fun. But it's going to be affordable. Yeah,
of course.
How we manage it is then what these zillions of texts between the two of us are going to be about. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so what if someone wants to become a resident? What do they do?
Bring bags of money? No.
You just said small tax.
Exactly.
Tiny little bit, not bags full, but just a little bit.
Extra contributions are always welcome. No, seriously. So we have the website, brida.eu, so brida.eu.
Yes.
And there you will find a WhatsApp button.
Exactly.
And that will lead to me.
Yes.
So don't be afraid to press that button. Just click on it and say, hi, my name is so-and-so. I'm blah, blah. I live in so-and-so. And I would like to be... I'd like to know more about it. What can you do? Can I help you? Can you help me? Etc. Etc. And then I will say, sure. And then depending on circumstances, I will either say, okay, here is Janita's number. Go speak with her, or can I help you? And then basically you tell us how you think we can help you,
Yes.
what you want to do, what your goals are. And then you are given the keys to enter the gate. So
Yes.
the actual community website is outside the actual promotional websites. It's a space on its own.
Yes.
You are given the keys to that. You enter your name and password that you choose yourself. Now, I have to say, I built this website, but the 20 or so members that are in there, I do not know and cannot find and will not find your passwords. It is even closed to me. Yeah. So, and because we are based in Europe, we have very, very strict data protection regulations here. And if I do not adhere to them, I'm going to have to pay somebody more money than I actually have, which is not very much anyway, but I don't want to give that to them. I'd rather invest it in Brida. So we have to, seriously, we have to adhere to European data protection
Yes.
regulations,
Yes.
irrespective whether you're in South Africa, India, on the moon, or wherever you are. The headquarters is in Europe, and that's where we have to adhere to legal and financial standards. Yeah.
Yes.
So all we get from you is your name and your email address. That's the only thing we need. That is visible to me because I have, of course, access to the back end of everything. But that's all I see. I just see your name and your email address, and that's all I'm really interested in. And once you have become a resident, the golden rule is tell us what you are prepared to share. If you do not want
Yes.
to talk about the 6 billion cats that you have in your garden, then don't tell us. Yeah, it's
Yes.
off the record. Yeah, we're not interested.
Exactly.
Well,
Yes.
actually, I would be, but
And
yeah,
with that amount of cats, I would also like to know, how
yeah,
did you do it?
yeah.
Where did they
But
come from?
but just to give you the case in point, so how
Yes.
this works, you have your clients, I have my clients. Again,
Yes.
there's a legal side to this. You are in South Africa, I'm in France. We are two separate legal and financial entities. We just share the same platform. And
Yes.
your Saudi Arabian resident, of course, you know more about her than I do. So I
Yes.
may have the role as a mayor, but in this particular constellation, I'm an ordinary citizen, and I have to wait for
Yes.
your resident to feel comfortable to say, well, actually, this is me and this is what I do, etc., which is not easy. I have to admit it, but there you go. That's what I have to do. Yeah. So I have to, so she works
Yes.
with you. Yeah.
Yes.
We have the common programs, but she works with you, and at some point I will get to meet this person and say, oh, really? Is that her? Oh, fantastic. Now, yeah. And then the dialogue, the conversation starts. Yeah. So
Yes.
go to the website, brida.eu. Send us a message. I don't use email or anything like that because you get so much spam and so much rubbish sent these
Yes.
days that WhatsApp
Yes.
is the best way. And then you are welcomed. You talk to either Janita or myself. If
Yes.
you think it is going to be a fit, Brida is not for everybody. You have to understand that. We give you a tour of the place.
Exactly.
Yeah. You get an idea of what's going on. You meet some other people,
Yes.
at least on the surface.
Yes.
Then you go, and then maybe you can get one or two test lessons or test meetings, and you go to a cafe and meet other residents and say hi. This is
Yes.
me. You get a welcome package, and then you just, if you say this is what I like, then you join in and follow and do
Have
what you
fun.
want and have fun. Yes, I remember that.
Luckily.
Yeah. So that's the practical side. That's the way it
Yes.
works. Yeah. And
Yes.
basically anything is possible
Of course.
within reason.
Within the reason, yes.
We, we don't have the breeder lottery. Yeah. So if
No.
you're looking to win the lottery numbers, then this is not going to be the place. Yeah.
Well, I can maybe share my lottery numbers that I got in my fortune cookie.
Oh, okay.
I can share mine and John's. We didn't use them, but I do have them.
Okay. Well, I have a lottery ticket here somewhere as well, and I did actually win 20 euros.
Wow.
But that was many months ago. It expires in a couple of weeks. And then that's probably when all the money will start flowing. So here's my lottery ticket. Yeah.
Yes.
And every Sunday morning I go to the website and discover that they didn't think of me. There you go.
Oh no.
Right. We have been gassing on for 90 minutes.
Yes, that's a long time. I hope we still have some listeners around.
I'm sure we do, because
Yes.
what is there not to want to know? And you've met the charming Fruit Loop. I mean, you just want to meet her, don't you? Yeah.
And what about you? We
I'm
also want to meet you.
I'm just the old goat, so But yes, but I'm always. I think one of these questions, these Fruit Loopy questions that you had, is what is your what is your favorite question or something? Oh, no, what is your favorite Brida conversation
Yes. What is
question?
your yes, exactly.
So some of you may have seen the film Out of Africa with Meryl Streep and Robert Redford. And there is this beautiful dinner scene where Robert Redford, Meryl Streep, and some other person are sitting at the dinner table. And she starts, the gentlemen have to give her the first line of a story. And then she starts telling this story. Now, we change this and say, so what's your story? Or something along those lines. And then we talk about the story. So storytelling is a central part of the Brida experience. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Tell us your story.
My story.
No, we'll do that. We'll do that.
We'll do that next time.
We'll do that next week. Yeah. So
yes.
I think
but we want to know the story from our listeners. What is their story?
And the other residents want to know the stories as well.
Yes. Why haven't you joined us yet? That's
Exactly.
Also what we want to know.
Yeah. Yeah. Where are you? Join us. Come here. Tell us your story.
Yes.
What can and not only tell us your story, but what is it that we can actually learn from you? Because
yes.
In our lunch conversations, we're going to expand this whole program.
Yes.
I just have to tell you about yesterday. Yeah. So Clea, who comes from a tiny village here in France, just around the corner from where I live, at the age of 16, moved to Seoul in South Korea. Now you've got a village of 1,000 people and a city of 18 million people, and you're moving at the very sort of delicate age, and you have to process this. And yesterday we were talking about leaving home, first steps, and her answer completely threw me, because you said, what's it like to leave home? And she's going to move in a couple of months. She's going to move from Seoul to Edinburgh in Scotland to start studying there, international relations. Yes. And she said, well, I actually left home 2 or 3 years ago, because I left my village, I left my home, I left my best friends, I left my school, I left everything behind and started a new life. And I thought, wow, this is a way of thinking that, I've been around for a couple of years and I've seen a lot of things, but this one really, really threw me. Yeah. And this is the beauty of it. This is the beauty of it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because it just widens the perspective, the horizons. You can do.
Yes. Different perspectives, different mindsets as well.
Yeah. Oh, you're a specialist on that one. If you are on LinkedIn, Janita Lagrange, you write really, really beautiful posts.
Thank you. You too.
Well, sort of.
Interesting stories and articles.
Yes, I'm more on the Brida page. We have a Brida page, Brida Town on LinkedIn. That's where you're going to find. We're not actually on any other social. We're on Blue Sky. I'm sort of developing something on Blue Sky, but we're not not really anywhere else. LinkedIn is sort of our playing ground.
Yes.
Janita Lagrange, every morning a post will appear, And if it doesn't, I sort of gently nudge her and say, look, I'm really missing these.
Are you going to post it?
Are
What's
you
happening? Are you okay?
exactly?
Is the
So
weather okay?
if you want something to think about, go to your profile, knock on the door, say, hi, it's me. I heard about you. And someone said your posts are fantastic. Can I please read them? And then I'm sure you will let them in and say, okay. Yeah, but really worth, I'm serious here, really worth looking at, reading, thinking about. Gives me something to do.
Something to think about every day.
Janita, you have the last word. I think we should wrap this up. You have the last word.
Join us. If you're still here, if you're still listening, if you're looking for something exciting, something fun, a place where you can just be yourself and obviously meet people from all around the world. I think we have people in each continent at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
You are more than welcome. Find our website, LinkedIn page, send a pigeon, smoke signals, we'll find you.
Morse code. And
Morse code, telegrams, all kinds of things.
telexes, if you know what a telex is.
Yes.
And if you still need convincing, we're going to do this potato peeling podcast on a weekly basis.
Yes.
It's Friday today where we're doing this, but we're sort of thinking of a Tuesday, but we might move it to a Friday. We haven't discussed this yet.
Yes.
But once a week, have a look at the Brida website, have a look at YouTube, have a look at LinkedIn, have a look at Spotify. You will find this podcast appearing there. And if you want to know more about what we do and how we think and why we do things and tralala, then
yes,
join us. If you want to contact us and join in and speak with us because you have this fantastic story or this fantastic idea, knock on the door. We will let you in. Maybe not immediately. Maybe it'll take a little time, but we want to.
Few minutes.
Few minutes. Yep. Few seconds.
Yes.
Please join us. This is not about us, you and Janita and I. This is about
yes,
people,
you.
life, the community, you. It's about everybody.
Yes.
Now, seriously, before I say goodbye, you now have the absolute last word. And don't give me any more ideas, Janita, because it's going to drive me crazy.
Okay. For everyone out there, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Find us on social media. Contact us. We are more than happy to be there, to open the door and to let you in. Thank you, Frank. That is the last word. Talk to you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.